Morning, everyone, and thanks for having me. It's an absolute privilege to be here, especially as on such a distinguished lineup of speakers. So, my name's Katie Black, and I'm here to tell you a bit about the UK's National Infrastructure Commission, what we do, why we exist, and what we've managed to achieve so far, and hopefully maybe to convince you of some of the merits of our approach. So, for those of you who may not have heard of us, the National Infrastructure Commission was created in October 2015. We provide independent strategic thinking, analysis, and advice to ensure that the UK is able to meet its long-term infrastructure needs. And we're at a really exciting point for ourselves as an organisation. In July, we published the UK's first National Infrastructure Assessment. This is a comprehensive look at the UK's economic infrastructure needs over the next 30 years and how the UK should go about meeting them. We've been working on this pretty much since we'd been created. But to uncover how we came into existence in the first place, I want to start by going a little further back in time. So firstly, why did the UK create a National Infrastructure Commission? What was the problem that the UK was trying to solve? The UK has some of the most mature infrastructure networks in the world. And generally speaking, we're not too bad at infrastructure delivery. The infrastructure for the 2012 Olympic Games was delivered on time and on budget, and construction of Crossrail, a major new underground line for London, has now entered its final stages. But we'd lost our ability to be visionary and forward-thinking. There were no strategic priorities for infrastructure. Too often, decision-making was delayed, or once taken, reversed, due to lack of consensus. The classic example of this is airport capacity in the southeast of England. 15 years since a white paper identified the need for the increased capacity at London's airports. Construction has yet to start. And while Crossrail is now nearing completion, it was first proposed in 1974. Our networks are subject to ever-increasing strain, and there are both big challenges and opportunities on the horizon. Climate change, population increase, technological developments. But government, quite naturally, finds it difficult to truly think long-term. And there was no sense of how to prioritise limited resources across different sectors. So, as part of their 2015 election manifesto, the UK's Labour Party outlined their plans to create a National Infrastructure Commission. This was informed by a review of infrastructure planning in the UK, carried out by Sir John Armitt, and I actually referenced a quote from it on one of my earlier slides. Although, in fact, several other reports had looked at the topic and come to fairly similar conclusions. Armitt's plan was for a statutory public body which would publish a national infrastructure assessment once a decade. Parliament would debate and vote on it, and plans for each sector would follow. The National Infrastructure Commission would then comment on these plans and monitor against them. Now, the Labour Party did not win the election, but the idea itself won out. And it was the Conservative Chancellor of the Exchequer, George Osborne, who announced our creation in October of that year. We were put to work immediately, tasked with looking at the future of London's transport, connections between cities in the north of England, and the potential benefits of creating a smart and flexible electricity system. At this point, it was still envisaged that we would be established in statute, but report to government, not Parliament. Government would be required by law to respond to our reports and to reflect our recommendations within national policy statements. However, in 2016, the parliamentary time required to pass such a law became much harder to come by, thanks to a small issue called Brexit. An election swiftly followed, together with some uncertainty around our fate. But the new government, headed by Theresa May, remained committed to the principles which led to our establishment in the first place. In this new world, we were formally established as an executive agency of Treasury. This means we sit at arm's length, in January 2017. And the government published a charter, which sets out its commitment to the Commission, defines the balance of responsibilities between us and the government, and also commits to our independence. Last month, we published our first National Infrastructure Assessment. So, how does the way we ended up being set up work in practice? The major difference, obviously, is that we are not set up in law. And whilst some in the industry and some of our wider stakeholders saw this as a weakening of our potential influence, in practice it has made little difference so far. We do work independently, and the Commission sees its influence being largely determined by the quality of work it produces, the impact it achieves, and whether or not we manage to create a consensus around our work. A body set up in law is more difficult to dismantle, but this is far from impossible and can still be neutralized or ignored. So whilst perhaps we are a slightly more fragile institution than originally envisaged, this does not change how we work or what we aim to do. In fact, the benefit of the Charter to us was that it was put in place quickly and smoothly, with minimum disruption, leaving us to get on with our work. An Act of Parliament would have been a much longer process. Where perhaps the decision not to proceed with the bill had more of an impact was the loss of the requirements on decision makers to take our work into account. Now, government has committed to respond to any recommendations that we say within 12 months. But statutory requirements would have given our recommendations a more direct route into policy. Similarly, the requirements on local decision makers to take our work where it has been endorsed into account are watered down. So 3 years down the road, and we're now in 2018, what do we look like now? I want to explain a little bit about how we're set up, how we sit alongside the Infrastructure and Projects Authority, and what we've done to date. So, originally chaired by Lord Andrew Adonis, a former Secretary of State for Transport, we are now headed up by an engineer and the author of the Armitt Review, Sir John Armitt. So he's quite vested interest in making us work. We have 7 commissioners who support him from a wide range of backgrounds, including economists, an architect, and business leaders. Supporting the Commission is a secretariat of about 40 staff, and we're a mix of civil servants, secondees from regulators, and industry experts. Our sponsorship team sits in the Treasury, and we have a multi-year budget of about 11 million New Zealand dollars a year. Our charter sets out 3 objectives for our work. Firstly, we want to support sustainable economic growth across all regions of the UK. We also aim to improve competitiveness and quality of life for the people that live there. And there are 3 parts to our role. Once every 5 years, we have been tasked with producing a national infrastructure assessment. This looks 30 years into the future and identifies the UK's infrastructure needs and then relates it back to a plan of action for government today. We also carry out in-depth studies into particular questions that are agreed with the government. And the third part of our role is to hold government to account. To do this, we publish an annual monitoring report. There are 6 sectors within our remit: energy, transport, digital, water, waste, and flood risk. And one interesting feature of what we do is that we have to show how all of our recommendations are consistent with government spending up to 1.2% of the UK's GDP on infrastructure. This means that anything we propose is both fully costed and prioritised within the fiscal remit that government has set us. So we will never be putting forward an unaffordable wish list of products. We also set out how anything that we suggest may impact on consumer bills. So what are we trying to achieve? Our aim is to be the UK's most credible, forward-thinking, and influential voice on infrastructure policy and strategy. To be credible means that we produce reports of the highest quality, written in plain English, independent of government and all vested interests. We make clear recommendations based on rigorous evidence. To be forward-thinking means that we take a strategic approach which links long-term priorities with short-term actions and considers infrastructure as a system, not as a collection of silos. We maintain an international perspective, engage closely with leading-edge expertise, and are always open to new approaches and ideas. And to be influential means that we work across society, government, parliament, and industry. We produce work which is objective, fair, and transparent. We look for deliverable solutions, and we follow up on any recommendations that we make. It's probably also worth touching on what we don't do. So the UK has a separate body which thinks about infrastructure delivery. This sits within the government as opposed to at arm's length and works to the Cabinet Office and the Treasury. The Infrastructure and Projects Authority covers both social and economic infrastructure, and it's responsible for the overall project delivery system. It owns the government's pipeline of major projects. So for the first few years, our major output was a series of studies that we undertook. And we used this to start punching above our weight. So the first 3 reports that we produced that I mentioned earlier were followed up by a report looking at 5G mobile networks and what we needed to do to get them delivered, looking at the transport and housing needs across the Cambridge-Oxford-Milton-Keynes corridor, and another report which focused on how we could use technology to maximize the productivity of our existing infrastructure, which ended up focusing largely on data. And through the recommendations we've made so far, we've seen action. We've seen true cross-government working on housing and transport within the Oxford-Cambridge corridor, something that many thought would be impossible to achieve. We've seen the setup of a new digital task force, development funding released for rail schemes in the north of England, and to accelerate delivery of smart motorways. We've also seen government publish a plan on how they plan to remove barriers to smart technologies across the energy system. Whilst we've had good progress so far, it's worth noting that it's been where we've tended to be pushing it at a fairly open door. Where our recommendations have been more challenging for government, so actually agreeing to Crossrail 2 project rather than providing development funding, or funding better mobile coverage on our road and rail networks, we haven't got as far. And this must be a key area of focus for us going forward. Yes, we are there to support government, but challenge is important too, where they are not delivering. So, our biggest piece of work to date was published last month. The National Infrastructure Assessment is our fully costed plan of action for the UK's infrastructure over the next 10 to 30 years. It is the first attempt to look at the long-term infrastructure needs across all of the sectors in our remit and prioritise. And we have set out what the government needs to do to achieve it. Without going into too much detail, because that's a speech all in itself, I want to give you a quick flavour of what it says. So firstly, digital infrastructure is now an essential utility which is increasingly underpinning everything, including our other infrastructure systems. And the UK's infrastructure, fibre infrastructure, is good for our needs today, but we're a bit behind. We've got 4% full fibre connections. Full fibre is the future-proof way to meet our needs, and the UK should rely on infrastructure competition where it's viable to deliver it, while subsidising rural and remote areas. Climate change addressing climate change is an essential part of our plan. The emissions from power, heat, and transport and waste make up about 70% of the UK's emissions. Reducing these emissions has seemed costly and difficult, but this need no longer be true. Our analysis has shown how the UK can achieve low-carbon power, heating, and transport in 2050 at the same cost to consumers as today. And within that, a highly renewable power system looks increasingly credible for us. To ensure that we are on a path to that, the Commission wants to see at least 50% of our power coming from renewables by 2030, up from 30% today. We also believe that there are lower cost, lower carbon options for waste treatment. We want to see consistent national standards for recycling and more ambitious targets, with 75% of plastic being recycled by 2030. Whilst our transport connections between cities are fairly good, there has been a lack of investment in the cities themselves. We want to see city-led plans for transport to connect housing and jobs, new long-term funding structures to give certainty to cities, and an increase in the funds available to them. £43 billion, so $80 million, of additional investment by 2040. At the same time, we need to be preparing for a revolution on our roads. Road vehicles of the future will be cheaper, cleaner, quieter, and safer. We want to enable the UK to reach 100% electric vehicle sales by 2030, and to ensure that we're maximising the potential benefits on offer from connected and autonomous vehicles. Climate change increases the risk of both flooding and drought. We have recommended that the UK should invest in making extra water supply available to reduce the risk of relying on emergency measures. This could save us up to £19 billion over 30 years. We have also recommended a national standard of flood resilience for all communities. To support this, the UK must make effective and timely decisions and get the best value over the lifetime of our infrastructure. In many ways, the National Infrastructure Assessment is the first of its kind, especially in the context of the UK. There was no blueprint for putting it together. No one had done anything quite like this before, although we did draw on some of the work done internationally, including in Australia and Canada. There were also single-issue independent reviews that we looked at. But in many ways, the assessment was a creative process as much as an analytical one. The potential scope of this piece of work was vast. It covers 6 sectors and all of their interactions, as well as cross-cutting issues such as funding and financing. Every issue was important to somebody, and this is why we spent a year identifying what the most important questions that we wanted to answer were. Our timelines were short. We were working on the assumption of a 2015 to 2020 Parliament. That meant completing the first assessment in about 2 years, rather than the normal 5. And whilst one of the real strengths of our Commission is that they come from such a range of backgrounds, this meant that no single perspective or methodology was likely to cut it. We had to build our capacity in parallel. We had only existed for 6 months when the work started, and we were initially small, less than 10. And we could not have achieved the outcome that we did without support from stakeholders. There was a huge deal of goodwill along the way for the assessment and the Commission. Lots of people helped us, and we're proud of the result. So, initial reactions have been positive. We've already seen the government setting out how it plans to adopt our recommendations on digital infrastructure. But it's also fair to say that there are some areas where we are making them uncomfortable, and some of our recommendations will be very challenging. So this will be the start of a conversation. Part of our job will be to continue to communicate why we reached the conclusions that we did, and continue to make the case. It's a new phase for us as an organisation. We now have a platform to communicate and build a consensus around. Our work on holding government to account will increase, and there are many areas where there is much more work to do. So, what could other people take away from the first 3 years of our existence? I want to offer 4 thoughts. The first is that the creation of the Commission was very well received. It was important for us that we had cross-party support for our existence from the start. We had a clear vision of the problems that we were set up to solve, which many people and organisations were bought into across the board. whilst not being set up in law like some of our sister bodies like the Committee on Climate Change. This has not hindered our ability to get on and start making a positive impact. What this means for us in the longer term, however, is an open question. But our goal is to get on with the task that we've been given and to do it to an extremely high standard. We perceive our independence to be key. Not only does it give us space to think creatively, it allows people to put their trust in what we say and helps us create a consensus around it. And lastly, whilst infrastructure decisions will never be completely depoliticized, which has to be right in a democracy, if our work can support and lead to better and more timely decision-making, ensuring that the UK is equipped for the future, then we will consider our job well done. Thank you.